The more I find out about the novel, the more it seems to me that actually people have been doing strange things with the form from pretty much as soon as it started. One of the things about Don Quixote that makes it so remarkable, well, two. One is the relationship between Sancho Panza and Don Quixote himself, the way that they explore their personalities, the way their personalities are expressed, the delight and humour and touching nature of that relationship makes it much more than just stock figures. The other is the self-awareness. This is particularly true in the second part of the novel, where there's a kind of dizzying meta-textual game going on about who wrote what. If we assume for the moment that it was Cervantes who wrote it rather than Cid Hamete Benengali, he jokes about who actually wrote it, claiming that it was Cid Hamete Benengali. At the same time, Sancho Panza and Don Quixote themselves question the issue of authorship, while at the same time professing that they know the truth about what has been written. But of course they're fictional characters, and here they are in a book written by somebody else, claiming that that book is written by somebody else, and the characters in that are claiming that the author has got it wrong. This kind of playfulness, although I don't think it's completely different from what had gone before, it does seem to set the book apart as a remarkable one. Apart from anything else, though, it's kind of human. Don Quixote and Cervantes list vast numbers of books of romance and chivalry and so on, which have clearly been hugely popular for centuries, since the likes of Malory's Morte d'Arthur and so on in the 13th, 14th century. So there's already been a history of great adventure stories, but there's something human about this one. There's something that makes it more than just the unreasonable and implausible adventures of someone. It turns it into something that has a more resonant humanity. And at the same time, the folk tales that gave rise to fables seem to me to be in a different category. They have maintained their popularity as much as Don Quixote, but there is something very human about Don Quixote, and very modern, I suppose. That may be what it is. Although there are plenty of references to things going on at the time that are no longer of any relevance, although there's plenty of arcana in there, the relationships and the crucial core of the book has, I'm afraid I'm going to have to use the word, has a genuine universality. The book is farcical, I mean almost violently farcical in the way that some black and white films could be. It's very funny to see custard pies being thrown in people's faces and pianos tumbling downstairs and people getting stuck underneath cars and so on. And that's the kind of physical humour that is very prevalent in the first part of Don Quixote in particular. There's an awful lot of fighting and very unpleasant tricks played on Don Quixote. He is the butt of jokes which leave him badly injured, as well as, of course, getting himself into injurious trouble of his own accord. So it's not surprising it was treated as a farce. As for the deeper themes, they are complex and all-encompassing. They seem to me to involve the nature of the self and reality, the legitimacy of dreaming, but also manners, honesty, whether it's better to pretend to be good or to be truthful and deceitful, to be kind, generous, warm and loving, or to be rigid in your attitude towards others. You see this in the way that there's several members of the church are not given a terribly attractive portrait, and there are plenty of people who are thoroughly unpleasant. Don Quixote may be horribly misguided, but he's not an idiot, he's not a fool, he's not completely blind, in fact rather the opposite, and I think this is perhaps, for me anyway, the core of it. There are several occasions where Don Quixote makes it quite clear that he knows what he's doing. He knows that he is all that all the previous knights-errant have ever been because he wants to be. He knows that Dulcinea is an ideal rather than an actual. He knows that he is deliberately, I think, adjusting the world to fit what he thinks it should be, that the hard, dry life he was living in his village beforehand wasn't enough, that something about the fictional nature of these romances was inspiring to his imagination, to, in a sense, his sense of self, that it inspired an aspect of his character that he couldn't otherwise express, and so he decided to express it. Sancho Panza is occasionally taken in by and prepared to believe what Don Quixote says, but more often than not he isn't. But he joins him, partly, no doubt, out of a sense of fun, trying to see what he might get out of it, but he grows to adore Don Quixote, and to treat him with both, if not reverence exactly, but great love. And Don Quixote similarly regards the fact that Sancho Panza is allowing these fantasies to be acted out and to respond to them appropriately, even when Sancho Panza has made a point of protesting about them and saying, "Don't do this, you're going to cause all kinds of trouble." The fact that he is loyal to him seems to be more important than whether or not he actually believes the same as Don Quixote. Quixote himself, as a character, is intelligent and well-read and enormously articulate, and, I mean, apart from the fact that there is something buffoonish about the overblown expressions that he uses to describe what he's going to be getting up to, there's something, I think, very moving about it, that he cares for the notion of protecting the innocent and the needy. He's prepared to put himself in genuine danger, and several times near death, in order to do what he thinks is the right thing, and he is constantly frustrated by the fact that what to him is the contemporary world, which of course is some 400 years old now, is not a patch on what it used to be, which is another reason why, of course, the book feels so modern. Everyone thinks that we're going to hell in a handcart, and Don Quixote has just decided that rather than live in a world that's doing that, he's going to adopt the manner of a world that wasn't going downhill so badly. And this naivety, of course, is the root of his troubles, because people who don't believe him know they can make fun of him and take advantage of him, and they do, which is, again, I think, it suggests a very violent world in which this was being written. And since we know that Cervantes himself was, for example, taken prisoner and served as a slave in the galleys and had to be rescued in a not dissimilar fashion to the story of the captive, we can see why the brutality that Quixote has to undergo is very much a part of that world, and the fact that he doesn't want to live like that, he doesn't want to live a brutish life, means that his actions are, of course, quixotic in the sense that we now have it, unnecessarily, dangerously noble to no good effect, but at the same time they suggest that there is something worth striving for, and I think that perhaps is what underlies the story and makes it a comedy, yes, but one with a deeper root. The book is full of conversations about reading, about books, about how good or bad they are or can be. I think it's something that all writers know, that if you're writing something, then you're very aware of the fact that it's going to be read and that you're undertaking an action which you hope will influence people, but you don't like it if they're influenced too much by stuff that you don't agree with, and so on and so forth. And it's been a staple, really, of fiction ever since, to play little games with people's expectation of the novel. And I think the book does that, in that it plays with what books are, what makes them good, what makes them acceptable. There's some really quite alarming stuff from the church about banning books and the suggestion that there should be a censor to read everything to make sure that only the improving as well as the educational gets through. Well, clearly this book was never going to pass that censorship, and obviously I think we can infer Cervantes didn't agree with that, because it seems to me that although Quixote's senses are addled by what he reads, again it seems that it's in a sense to the positive. He could have lived a quiet life, eking out his days, but he didn't. He decided to stand up and do something absurd and impossible and take the risk for it. And that kind of nobility, I think, perhaps suggests that however much his senses may have been addled by the reading, it also gave him a way out, an escape, a means of exercising and expressing himself. I don't think there's any one particular bit that I think of as a favourite. They're all equally ridiculous and marvellous. There's the continuing discussions between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, I think, are charming. Sancho's wide-eyed innocence, Don Quixote's absolute certainty of his conviction concerning what he is doing, and the way that they batter against each other but keep forgiving each other and wanting to forgive each other. I think that throughout is a delight. Part 2 was written 10 years later, or was published 10 years later, and 2 or 3 areas make it different. On the one hand, there had been published a fake sequel, and Part 2 refers to that quite a lot and says quite a lot of, as you would expect, unpleasant things about the author of that fake sequel. But the most significant shift is that although Part 2 appears to begin just 60 days after Part 1, the characters become aware that the first part has been published and has been well received. They become, as it were, characters in their own fiction as well as characters in their own real lives. And this kind of self-referential element is quite strong in Part 2. The other element of Part 2 is that it's more, I suppose, philosophical. There are slightly fewer adventures, more discussions, but fewer entirely separate issues. Part 1 did have several episodes which were not really to do with the main thrust of the story at all, and there were long sequences of stories told by people or novels found by people that get read or repeated pretty much in full. But I think what Part 2 does is take what may have been originally the idea of a spoof of these romances, which I think it had stopped being fairly early on in Part 1, and develops the idea of chivalry and quest and self and your obligations to the world and so on. The ending is very difficult, I think. I suppose when I first thought of it, I didn't know the book, and I kind of assumed that that Don Quixote would return to his home and live out the rest of his days quietly, having made Sancho Panza a knight on a plain somewhere, and that we'd all feel quite good about it. But actually he gets broken by the endless jibes and taunts and games and tricks played on him, and it seems to me that he's kind of destroyed by that, rather than by his own apparent insanity, that it was his insanity, his unreason, that was giving him a sense of purpose, a sense of joy, a sense of delight, and I think it's a very ambivalent conclusion. And perhaps that's one reason why the book is still considered a great work of fiction, because there is so much that is uncertain. There is so much that is not absolutely clear. It's often said that with great works you can keep on going back to them, and one of the reasons for that is because you're never quite sure what it means. It's never absolutely cut and dried. It's never utterly certain in any sense. There are implications and possibilities underlying all the actions all the time. And that, it seems to me, is one reason why this is such a great book, that a lot of books at the time had very little uncertainty about them, very little moral ambivalence about them. And there is about this. It's complicated. There are many questions to ask about both the people and what they do and the broader moral lessons of it, while at the same time it's funny, and it's human, and it's touching, and it covers such a vast range of ideas and subjects and so on. I think that adds a gloss and a warmth and a depth and a universality and humanity to the whole story, because although it is a great adventure tale of this man setting off on his mad conquests with his faithful squire beside him, it is also about what you are prepared to do, what you're prepared to believe, what you love, what you will do for what you love, and all that sort of thing, alongside discussions about what literature is good for you, what is the purpose of chivalry, why should one behave in such and such a fashion. So you have this narrative which takes you along with you, and these characters, these core characters, who again become self-aware and who are treated in a kind of modern sense by the author. There are occasions where they disappear from view and the author says he doesn't know what happened. Now that's quite a sophisticated literary trick, which I suppose we've arrogantly assumed was a recent innovation of the novel, but it's here in a book published in 1605 and 1615. There is an awful lot in Don Quixote, and there is something permanent about the notion of a quest and a loyal friend. Perhaps that's what makes it a great work of fiction.